Dr. Joshua Blank, Research Director at the Texas Politics Project at UT Austin. Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it. As you know, former President Trump and now presidential candidate Donald Trump, he's returning to Texas over the weekend and holding a rally in Waco. Why Texas? Why Waco? Why now, do you think?
Well, those are all very interesting questions. First and foremost, Texas is the cornerstone of any Republican presidential candidate's overall strategy, in the Electoral College. So thinking ahead to the general election, Texas is a pivotal state. But Texas is also a major donor state to Republican candidates. And so ultimately, any national candidate interested in capturing the GOP nomination is wise to spend some time in Texas, if nothing else, raising money.
And what do you make of, because all this is happening as we are waiting to see if the district attorney in Manhattan in New York City files charges, if a grand jury files charges, indicts former President Trump in relation to a payment he made to Stormy Daniels. What are the political ramifications for the former president if he is indicted?
Well, I think that they are various. I think a lot of people have rightly pointed out that an indictment has never really helped a politician in the long run. But for Donald Trump, he's not a normal politician. And so I think, looking ahead to the Republican primary and thinking about Donald Trump's approach to politics, and really, the approach to politics, it really centralizes his grievances and tries to really ultimately mobilize those grievances, on behalf of voters and try to make his grievances theirs. This is really something that probably plays to his strengths, especially in a Republican primary. It allows him to point to Democrats still attacking him. It allows him to point to what, he and his supporters perceive as an unfair system, political attacks against him. So this really, brings Donald Trump back into the spotlight at a point in which, he's ebbing and flowing in his importance within the Republican Party. I think even more importantly, what this does is it forces Republican elites, not voters, but those Republicans in the government, in the Congress, to pick sides. Regardless of whether or not they think that these charges are valid or not, there's really no upside for most Republican candidates or elected officials at this point to side with a Democratic district attorney in New York against the former president. And so in a contest in which, Ron DeSantis the Florida governor's been getting increasing attention, this has really actually tipped the scales back in Trump's favor in terms of what people are talking about in Republican circles, what they're focused on, and who they're defending.
The former president already has his core of loyalists, supporters who are going to vote for them. I've talked to them and they are still backing the former president. And so they're going to be with him regardless. I'm wondering, does this hurt the former president when it comes to Republicans who supported him before, but now worry that, with this indictment and others, this lays out and, validates their thought that maybe they should back somebody else?
I really don't think so. And I'll tell you why. We've been doing a lot of polling at the Texas Politics Project, the University of Texas, Austin, over the course of Donald Trump's presidency and since then. And the reality is that, especially in Texas, there's really a very small share of Republicans for whom the president is unelectable. And if we look back over the course of his presidency, in the last few years, his job approval never dipped below 86% among Republicans. If we look after his presidency, his favorability numbers have been similar. In fact, after the January 6 riots, between 85 and 86% of Texas Republicans said that they held a favorable view of the former president. Fewer than 17% have ever said that they hold an unfavorable view. We've asked about whether the former president has ever done anything that would disqualify him from future office. And this includes after his first impeachment trial and also after the January 6 riots. And in response to those questions, the vast majority of Republicans, north of 4 in 5 Republicans, said no. And so, there's no reason to think that an indictment over information that is not new to the public is going to all of a sudden shift Republican voters' views about Donald Trump's electability and fitness for office?
I'm wondering, because I've talked to some Republicans, and at least one person was willing to tell me on the record. We interviewed her. She was an early supporter of President Trump's back in, when he was running the first time in 2016, supported him in 2020. Now she prefers Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. And I'm wondering, the more that comes out, if he's indicted here, he's also facing, there's a grand jury in Washington, D.C. about the documents. There's a investigation in Georgia as far as the vote there back in 2020. And so I'm wondering, the more that the former president faces this, I mean, are people starting to look at, other options out there, regardless of whether they, support the former president? Do you think more people would start looking at DeSantis?
I think that's a definite possibility. But when we've asked Texas Republicans whether or not they think Donald Trump should run again for president, only a third say that he should not run. The majority, between 50 and 60%, think that he should still run again for president. And what that indicates is that there's definitely room in a Republican primary for other candidates to create space for themselves. And I think Florida Governor Ron DeSantis is doing a pretty remarkable job, really, of filling that space. But the reality is a third of voters is not going to win you the Republican primary. And Donald Trump's overwhelming support amongst Republicans generally, but especially among, I think very committed Republicans likely to vote in the Republican primary, makes it hard to imagine at this point in time how he wouldn't capture the nomination, barring some kind of significant legal problem. The reality is that, most of, the fictions that Donald Trump has created around his conduct have been accepted by most Republicans. When we ask people whether or not Joe Biden legitimately won the presidency, 2/3 of Texas Republicans have continued to say that he did not legitimately win the presidency. Other polling has shown that over the same time period, despite the fact that this persistent, attitude is held, that when you ask these same voters, well, is there evidence of this? The share who say yes continues to decline. And so ultimately, what that says to me is that, for a core share of Republican voters and a core share of really, again, Republican primary voters, these sorts of potential, external circumstances are pretty easily handled by the president, by the media ecosystem that he and they live in, and by the type of information they consume. And so, yes, the president faces, or the former president faces, a number of legal challenges that would imperil most people's political careers individually. But the reality is that this is almost in some ways a drop in the ocean, given a presidency that was full of crises, fair amount of chaos, and a lot of legal questions.
What do you make of the fact that Donald Trump has consistently criticized Governor DeSantis? He's not a declared candidate, but I think while everyone's imagination, he's running.
Yes. Well, look, I mean, Donald Trump has no problem going after his rivals, whether they be Democrats or members of his own party. And Governor DeSantis is no exception. The reality is that, the Florida governor has done a remarkable job introducing himself, not just to Texans, but to America. And I say that as a pollster, right? Which I shouldn't say too loud, because, when we polled people's attitudes on Ron DeSantis in Texas back in February of this year, 75% of Republicans held a favorable view of the Florida governor. Trump's favorability was at 79%. Abbott's was at 85%. This is really, again, as someone who looks at public attitudes, normally you would say, what would you expect the recognition of an out-of-state politician to be? And you'd say, well, maybe 30 to 50% of people might know about him. Within the party, it might be a little bit higher. But Texans and Americans know who Ron DeSantis is. And ultimately, that's a threat to Trump unless he can define DeSantis more negatively for that same set of voters.
And my last question, just on the Republican primary, and that is, does former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations in the Trump administration and South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley, does she have any chance in this primary?
Well, I wouldn't say no, because ultimately no votes have been cast, and I think that's a little bit aggressive. But I think she has it's a very long shot for her. And I'll just say, because if you just look simply at the attitudes towards the two seeming frontrunners right now, former President Trump and Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, and they are universally known and almost universally liked among among Republican voters. Nikki Haley has a long way to go to even get introduced to that share of the electorate that already has positive attitudes about two other candidates.
And my last question to you is, what is the likelihood that we will see a rematch of 2020 next year between former President Trump and President Biden, given, especially when you look at the polls, and some polls say, a majority of Republicans want someone else, a majority of Democrats want somebody else to run. So, how do you square all these?
Well, I would say that the likelihood is extremely high right now that the sitting president in his first term will run again for re-election. I think Donald Trump, right now is the prohibitive front runner in the Republican primary, and there's a good reason to expect that he too will be the nominee. But I think, the other question would be, if not them, then who? And right now, there's not a lot of discussion, certainly on the Democratic side, about who a viable alternative would be. And on the Republican side, the question in a lot of ways is whether DeSantis can continue his ascent, or whether Trump's now more direct attacks and DeSantis's response do much to either help or hurt his overall campaign. And so I think, betting money would still be on a rematch of the 2020 election. But one other, I think factor I'll put in there right now is, let's see how the economy is doing in the spring of 2024. And we'll see what impact that has on, I think Joe Biden's decision to continue on.
Dr. Joshua Blank, Research Director at the Texas Politics Project at UT Austin. Thank you so much for joining us. As always, we appreciate your insight.
Thanks for having me.